Hello friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And I'm here today to talk about how we live partially off-grid and why we choose to do what we do, at least for now. Because some people wrongly think that we're totally off-grid because we do a lot of off-grid stuff and we have a solar power setup. And then you got people on the other side that when we talk about our off-grid pieces of property that we plan to keep that way, they wonder, well, how can you be off-grid if you're putting videos on YouTube? But I'm not going to be talking about our two other off-grid pieces that we don't live on. We live here. We may live on one of those someday, but right now how we're making this work here and why we do it the way we do, that's the topic of today. Initially, how this got started was just looking for more and more ways that we could be less dependent on the public utilities, especially in the event of the very common power outages that happen. We get several every year here. That's just the way it is. And though it's rare that they last longer than a day, they can go much longer than that. So it's always nice to have backup, especially since you don't know if there might be something that will knock it out for a whole week or 2 weeks or longer, as has happened to one of my family members that lives in a much bigger town than we do. And their little household was without power for at least 2 weeks, I think it was. And it was just them, nobody else. So I like to always have backups of some kind. So that was how we got started. It wasn't that we were trying to make this home completely off grid. We just wanted to know that we could still continue to make do whether we had power or not. And we can, and we do. So we have various means for doing things without public electricity. So obviously the biggest one would be our solar power. But even though we have a pretty big setup, we have a nice big battery bank, we have a lot of solar panels, when you live in a place like we do that's almost persistently cloudy and rainy, especially for 9 months out of the year, it's rare we get sun. We do have sunny days during that time, but not very often. Then our solar power is pretty low during that time. We still get some, but then there's days we hardly get any at all, which would probably have some of you asking, well, why did you go with solar power knowing that? Well, it was just one of the many ways. We battled back and forth on this one for a while, trying to decide if it was going to be a wise move. And honestly, even though we can't fully depend on it through the whole year, we can use it to some extent all year round. So that does save us money on our electricity bill. Now, will it be enough to ever pay the cost that went into it? Probably not, but we have the peace of mind of knowing that we own that, and it can be something that in the winter we can fall back on. So in the wintertime we use it, we really limit the amount we use because it is pretty scarce. So we keep it to the minimum so that when the power goes out in the winter, because that's when it's going to happen, we can fall back on that. And if it's at the darkest time of the year and we can't even fall back on the solar power because we're just not getting enough collection, then we have other means to make up the difference, and that would be using one of our other generators. We have gas generators and diesel generators. We prefer not to do that if we don't have to. We'd really try to use the solar as much as possible in that case. But in the summertime, we can live almost completely on the solar power. But that's also the reason why we haven't gone completely off grid when it comes to our public power, because there's a lot of times when the public power is the backup for everything else that we do because we live in such a dark area. So they both, all these different things all complement each other. But we try to do the best we can to conserve the public power usage and rely more on the energy that we get for free, whether it be from the sun or from using manual things such as a manual food processor or a manual mixer. But there is a lot that we can run through the whole year off of our solar power. Most of the time we can run our refrigerator and freezers off solar power through the year, and our internet. But there is at least 1 month there where it's just too dark, where we have to switch everything over to public power. So we installed our own solar power. We are not grid tied. We chose to go that way so we could have the freedom to do what we wanted with our own setup and not have to go by whatever they decide for us. So though, yes, being grid tied, you can earn money during the time of the year where you're getting more power than you can use. To me, it wasn't worth it to give up that freedom to have the choice to do what we wanted with our own setup. So how it is right now is Patrick had installed 4 different outlets in the house. So that's all we got right now is 4 different outlets. We don't have any in this room. So right now the light I'm using is run off public power but I could, if I really needed to, run an extension cord out to the laundry room where one of our solar outlets is. So in the laundry area, that solar outlet will run our big freezer and our washing machine and my dehydrators when I'm not putting the dehydrators outside because it's too wet out there. Then they sit out there on the freezer, and that's where I do my dehydrating using the solar power outlet there. Now this dehydrator back here is my newest one. I set it up in here so I can use it year round for things that wouldn't do as well using my wood stove dehydrator, such as dehydrating eggs. But still, most of my dehydrating is going to happen either with the wood stove dehydrator in the winter or with the electric dehydrators on the solar power. And then we have another outlet that is in our kitchen that can run everything in the kitchen as we need to. And I have things hooked up in such a way that we can run everything off of that. During the time of the year, we're getting enough solar power to run everything. But that also includes our lighting. So the lighting in the laundry room, the lighting in the living room, which is where another one of our solar power outlets is. And then there's another one in the dining area. All these can be used to run our lighting, which is mostly just LED string lighting. So we keep our lighting very subdued, and it uses so little light using those that we can just plug those into any of the solar outlets and use those year round because they pull so little electricity. And then what happens during the low times of the year, because the solar outlets are not far from a public power outlet, we can just switch the cords over. So especially like in the laundry room, they're right next to each other. Same thing in the kitchen. I have outlets right next to each other, public power and solar power. So if our solar power is really low, I can simply switch from solar power, unplug the refrigerator from solar power, plug it into the public power, and when we're getting plenty of solar power, switch everything back over again. That's what happens with our washing machine, our freezers, our refrigerator, and anything else like that. It all gets switched according to the time of the year. So now let me talk about some other manual things that we currently have and use so that we either do not have to currently depend on the public power, or we know we can use them in the event of a power outage, be it an extended one or a short time one. So that would be like my country living grain mill, because it is hand crank. I do have a motor for it that Patrick built that can be plugged either into solar power or into public power, and that gets used quite a bit that way now instead of the hand cranking, because the hand grinding does take a long time. But in either event, even if I don't have enough solar power and I don't have public power, I can still grind by hand. I mentioned the mixer, I mentioned the hand crank food processor. I don't use this a lot, but it does get used during the time of the year that I'm grinding up tomatoes. But the one thing I use most that doesn't rely on electricity at all is my treadle machine. And I've had that thing, I think, 8 years now, and it's been the longest running sewing machine I've ever had, and I love it. I love it better than any electric machine I've had, and I don't have to worry about running an extension cord, since it's way over here and the closest solar power outlet's way out there. I don't have to run an extension cord when the power goes out. I just keep using it, power or not. It's there and it works for me. Now, Patrick has a lot of power tools and he needs to use them a lot. He has table saws and drill presses and radial arm saws and sanders and grinders and many things that run off power, which is one of the many things, especially because of all the things that we make for our store or do or sell locally. He needs those power tools. And so a lot of that during the summertime, he runs out all off of solar power. But there's no way that we would be able to collect enough power to run all of his tools in the wintertime, especially middle of winter, off of the solar power alone. So he'd either have to fall back on one of the fuel generators, or we just stick with the public power, which in this case is obviously going to be less expensive to run than having to depend on fuel to do that. So another reason why we still stay on the grid as far as public power goes, because if we had to use all our fuel generators to run everything all the time, that's going to be far more expensive in the long run at this point. But we could do it if we absolutely had to. But we do know there are plenty of old-time hand tools that you can use out there. I know Patrick has some that he could fall back on in a pinch, but a lot of times having electricity to run power tools is going to make a job go much faster. So when you're in a time crunch, these things can be important, which is why initially I loved grinding my grains by hand. But as my time got more and more scarce, or more and more precious, having the motor on that made a huge difference and saved me literally hours and hours of grinding. What would take me an hour to grind a cup of flour or more is now down to just maybe a couple of minutes. I can have a cup or two of flour with the motor. So that's part of the thing too about having some sort of electricity, is it can sure save time when you don't have a lot of time. Now, if I was no longer doing YouTube and all this other stuff, or my Etsy store, then I would have time to do all this stuff by hand. So let's go back to the wood stove. The great thing about our setup is because we have a wood stove, it makes up the difference in most things and what we cannot do on solar power during the winter. So from late spring to early fall, when we got plenty of solar power, I have electric hot plates that I move into the kitchen. And then I have my toaster oven, and they all get run off of the solar power. But in the winter, I then fall back on my wood stove for most everything. I still may use the toaster oven, but at least it uses less electricity than the full range does when I need to bake something in the toaster oven. I also have a wood stove oven now, and we even have a propane run oven that sits in here that I can use if I really have to. So, but really most everything happens with the wood stove in the wintertime. It is our source of heating water for washing dishes. We can also heat water for cleaning ourselves up. I used to do that on a regular basis, but most of the time we just use our electric run hot water heater. But if we didn't have that, we could simply rely on the water we heat up on the wood stove. Obviously, it heats our house. It dries our laundry at least 9 months out of the year. At least we have a few months where I can hang the clothes mostly outside. It's also where I do about 95% of my cooking and baking is on that wood stove. And any dehydrating I'm going to be doing, other than eggs, I'm going to be doing on the wood stove dehydrator that Patrick made. Sometimes that'll be on top of the wood stove, like if I'm doing meat and other heavier things. The rest of the time it's going to be next to the wood stove, and that's predominantly where it sits. But I have two of them there. One I can take and set up on the wood stove for when I'm doing jerky. So if we absolutely had to, we could have our public power completely shut off and we could survive just fine, but we would still have to depend on fuel of some sort, be it wood, gas, or diesel, to run some of the things that we have. So it is also important, if you're looking at going more off-grid or just having off-grid ways of doing things in the event of power outages, try to look more at things that don't require fuel other than sun. That could be a big investment, but more and more it is getting easier to get solar setups that don't cost quite as much as they used to, or even something that's simple enough to charge batteries so that you can have your battery operated things, such as my battery operated lanterns that I have that I absolutely love. But we also have quite a few other lanterns that run off fuel of some sort, be it an oil or a gas. And then we have candles, but those are all some sort of fuel. But things like solar ovens, you can build your own. I did a video just on solar oven comparisons, and even gave some suggestions on building your own. It can be as cheap as some cardboard, newspaper, and maybe some black paint and something clear to put over the top. I'll be putting a link to that video down below, as well as the last one I did on light sources. and cooking sources. There's several videos I'll be putting down below. If you're trying to look at various ways that you can cover yourself that doesn't require you to have to run out and get firewood or stock up on fuel. We try to do all things because everything's going to have its place depending on the situation. Right now with the price of fuel, we're going to really limit using any of that kind of stuff and focus more on battery operated things that we can easily charge on our solar power, because even through the darkest part of the year we can still keep things charged up, such as computers, phones, and our lanterns, because that doesn't pull a whole bunch of power at once, using our solar power, or things that we can do by hand. Obviously during the time of the year that we're getting plenty of solar power, we're going to fall back on that far more than using fuel. Now, I do all my canning on propane outside during the nicer months of the year, but if I absolutely had to, I know I could do some canning on our rocket stove, which the nice thing about a rocket stove is it doesn't take very much to run it. The bad thing is you have to feed it constantly. You can just throw pine cones, little pieces of wood and garden scraps in there, and you can get a nice hot fire going with a rocket stove, be it one you buy or build yourself. And you can actually do canning and all kinds of cooking on that. I have some old videos I did back when I was pulling the rocket stove out in the summer, but I haven't done any canning on it. I know I could at least do some water bath canning and not be afraid of that. I'm still nervous about using a pressure canner on it, but I could if I had to. So some of these other things are some things that you can look into, that again I mentioned in those videos that I'll be linking to down below. I'm not sure because I didn't quite follow my notes in the order that I wrote them down, but I think I covered everything that I meant to cover in this, just to give you guys an idea of how we make things work around here and why we do things the way we do. That even though no, we're not completely off grid, we still do as much as we can off grid, and also to stay in practice for when that time comes yet again where we have absolutely no power whatsoever. We know that we have the skills and the means to make things work without the need for public electricity. So I hope you found this video helpful. Again, please check out the video links I'll be putting in the description box down below, and I'm sure there's a lot more that I can think of I'll put down there. And eventually, even though we have an old video of our solar power setup, it is old and has since been updated. We still have the same amount of solar panels, but we have a much bigger battery bank, and we have a different setup in the power room. So one of these days Patrick needs to do an update on it. Hopefully this summer he can get to that. I keep saying we're going to, but things just get so busy and it's a matter of remembering when he's not doing other projects. So hopefully we'll do that, but in the meantime I'll go ahead and link to the old video down below, at least so you can get an idea of our setup, even though it is a little bit different. But I don't necessarily recommend, by the way, going solar or trying to go completely solar. Look at other means like having a wind power or something like that. There's a reason why we chose not to go with a windmill, because in our neighborhood here, it's just, even though we get a lot of wind in the wintertime, it's just way too noisy for living in a neighborhood. So, and it has too many parts that move on it that can easily break down. Where solar power, you do have to upkeep on it, but there's no moving parts. So that makes that easy, and it's quiet, but I don't necessarily recommend it for everyone, especially if you live in an area like ours. But it can still be, like with us, a supplement to what you're already doing. Okay, well, I hope you found this video helpful, and any ideas, suggestions, thoughts you would like to share, please do so down below. And thanks for watching. Take care, and God bless.